Hello, everyone, and welcome so much. Thank you for attending tonight. My name is Sarah McKenna. I am here on behalf of the Louisville Bar Association Public Service Committee. We're putting together this program, Know Your Rights, Voters' Rights, with the Louisville Black Lawyers Association. I'll turn it over to Michelle Duncan to introduce herself on behalf of that organization.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in to watch this virtual forum. I am the representative for the Charles W. Anderson Jr. Bar Association, formerly known as the Louisville Black Lawyers. I think I speak for Sarah as well as myself on behalf of our organizations that we thought in today's climate a Know Your Rights forum would be very informative and very important for the general public, and we are happy to have put together this wonderful panel of very distinguished members of our community to just give everyone a few more tips and things that they should know when they go to the polls. Now, if we could have each panelist just identify yourself, what your current role is, and your background, just briefly for everyone. Starting with Secretary Adams.
Hi, I'm Michael Adams. I'm the Secretary of State, the Chief Election Official for the Commonwealth. My background is I started running campaigns professionally as a teenager. I've always been involved in politics in some fashion. I've served in senior government roles in state and federal government as well. And for about 13 or so years before I did this, I had a national election law practice representing candidates, parties, committees all across the country, all 50 states. So that's my background.
Senator McGarvey.
Hey, I'm Morgan McGarvey, and I am the Democratic leader of the state Senate. I'm a lawyer in my day job and was in law school with Michelle Duncan. So it's great to be on the Zoom here with her tonight and looking forward to talking about the upcoming elections with everybody.
Professor.
Hello, everybody. I'm Eugene Mazo. I'm a professor at the Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville. I'm a voting rights scholar and an election law scholar. I've written about voting rights, campaign finance, redistricting, all kinds of issues related to your right to vote. And I write about these issues and I've studied them for many years. So pleased to be here.
Thank you. Heather Gatnarek.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Heather Gatnarek. I'm a staff attorney with the ACLU of Kentucky here in Louisville. We do a lot of different things at the ACLU of Kentucky, but voting rights is one of our primary issues that we're working on this year in particular. So we're really excited to talk about some of our work with election protection and making sure that everyone can access the polls.
And last but certainly not least, Mr. Kungu Njuguna.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Kungu Njuguna. I'm a local attorney here at the law firm of Hessig and Pohl, and I also sit on the board of the ACLU.
Fantastic. Thank you all again for being part of this panel. Secretary Adams, why don't we start with a general overview of how to vote in the upcoming election? It's my understanding citizens can vote either by absentee ballot or by physically going to a polling location during either the early voting period or on election day. Is that correct?
Well, it's never been easier to vote in Kentucky history than it is this year. Voters have had 4 easy ways to vote. You can vote by absentee ballot and return it by mail, and we pay for your postage. You can vote by absentee ballot and drop it off yourself in a drop box. We found those to be really popular with both parties' voters. You can vote in person on November 3rd, or you can do what I did. You can vote in person before November 3rd. We've got 3 weeks, 6 days a week, Saturday voting for the first time in Kentucky history, 3 weeks of in-person voting, 19 total days the polls are open. We're doing this to make it more convenient to vote, but particularly to make it safe to vote by helping us spread out the crowds and ensure that we don't have a disaster on November 3rd, whether it's to social distancing or just the inability of our fewer poll workers and fewer locations to process all the voters we're going to have. My current projection for turnout is 72%. That's historic. If we have everybody slam the polls on one day in a 12-hour span, it's going to be a long day. So my goal is to try to make this as easy for voters as possible by giving them multiple options. But I think the way that we can most efficiently process voters in and out is to do it in early voting. And today actually was the 6th day of that. We've got, again, 19 days total.
And that continues until November 2nd, is that correct?
That's right. It runs until the day before Election Day. Let me clarify, the deadline to request an absentee ballot passed on the 9th of October. To get one now, you would have to have a literal medical emergency, appendicitis or something like that. It can't just be a COVID situation unless it's a medical emergency. It can't just be the fear. But we've tried to push folks to vote that way if due to their age or health they need to do that. My expectation is about 30% of the vote will be absentee. It was 75% in the primary. Our system really can't handle 70% of 72% turnout being in one method. So part of what the governor and I, through joint agreement, have tried to do is encourage people to use different options. What's right for you may not be right for someone else, but hoping that people will pick different options and no one leg of this stool will be under too much pressure.
So starting with the early voting, I know in Jefferson County, there are 4 locations that remain the same throughout the entire early voting period. Can you show up to any one of those locations, or are they broken down by precinct like we're used to?
Well, it varies county by county, but in Jefferson specifically, they're all vote centers. Vote centers are an idea I actually offered in legislation before the pandemic. The idea is I've seen over the quarter century I've been involved in politics, so many voters who are disenfranchised because they go to vote at the wrong location. They moved and then they go to their old precinct and they say, oh, you can't vote here anymore. It's a really arbitrary model that comes from the 1800s, and I think we've outgrown that. With a vote center, you can vote anywhere that people are voting. We can do that now through technology. It used to be you couldn't do that because you could vote at one place and go down the street, vote somewhere else, and we wouldn't catch you until the election was over. Now we can catch that in real time through the use of e-poll books. So it's possible to let people vote where it's most convenient for them. And maybe you work in downtown Louisville and it's easier to vote at the Yum Center than at the Marriott East. Well, then great, you go do that. So in Jefferson specifically, and in most of our counties, all of the voting locations are vote centers where any person in that county can vote. But I did require, with the agreement of the governor, that every county have at least one vote center in this election, because people they used that in the primary, they got used to it, they like that. This ensures that anyone who lives in the county can go vote without any confusion.
Senator McGarvey, what will voters need to have with them in order to vote?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Michelle. I want to thank Secretary Adams. I think that we've done a really good job. He and the governor have done a really good job of getting a plan forward that's going to allow people to vote safely and easily. I mean, I'm excited. I live in Louisville, and to see the voting already going on, to be going on Saturdays is a really big deal. It's something we've pushed for a number of years. So thrilled to see people get that opportunity. And we use the word no excuse. That's what it means. You don't need an excuse to go in. You can just go in and vote. As Secretary Adams said, you can go to any of the locations, the one that's most convenient to you. You've got mail-in ballots that you could have gotten just because of COVID. And then, of course, as Secretary Adams said, you can still get an absentee ballot. And so you can vote on Election Day at one of 20 locations in Jefferson and other counties throughout the Commonwealth. You get to vote on Election Day too. So a really good plan, and much better than the old plan of you get to vote from 6 to 6 on Election Day unless you have some very provable and verifiable excuse. Like in 2018, I had to vote absentee because I was coming back from a business trip and didn't know if I'd make it back in time to vote. And I felt like, I'm trying to explain my life away, saying, "Is this? I really don't think you're flying through Atlanta. I really might not be back in time." So it's one of those things. Thank you, Secretary, for doing that. What you need with you, you do need a photo ID this year, and Senate Bill 2 is requiring most everyone to have a government-issued photo ID. You do not have to have one. There are several ways you can still vote without a government-issued ID, and Secretary Adams, you can chime in and correct me anytime I misstate something, but you can first of all say that you weren't able to get one for whatever reason. COVID could be a reason why you don't have an up-to-date driver's license or something. And there are several forms of identification you can provide, including even a credit or a debit card, government food stamps, SNAP, any of those types of things that you have that's a positive identification. You can also file a provisional ballot if you don't have one of those types of identification with you that allows you to still cast your vote and come back later to prove that you are who you say you are. And so if you have a driver's license, take it with you. If you have another form of picture ID, and Secretary Adams, there are several other forms of picture ID. You can take a military ID, I know is one. Was college ID, is that one we ended up doing?
Yes, that's right. College can be public or private.
Mm-hmm. So there's several forms of picture ID. If you have a good picture ID, take it with you. If not, still let people know that voting is your right and you have the right to vote and cast that vote in the election.
Just to follow up on that, Senator, if you could just briefly tell us what a poll monitor is and what their role is.
I'm assuming you mean poll, what we call typically poll challengers in this, is that? Okay,
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, poll challenger, you have to sign up in advance to be a poll challenger. I think the deadline to sign up to be a poll challenger now has passed for this upcoming election. So you have to sign up to be a poll challenger. Each party can get a poll challenger at a polling location. Did that change this year with the fewer number of polling locations, Michael?
So actually, this is something the State Board of Elections is taking up tomorrow morning.
Okay.
Current state law says that each precinct can have 2, but we're not doing precinct-based elections, and so we're going to sort out in the morning how many people we think should be permitted to serve in these roles. The McGrath campaign, I understand, has already submitted 172 challengers. I don't know that we're going to be able to accommodate that level of turnout within the polling sites and ensure social distancing. So that's one of the things that we've got to sort out on the board tomorrow morning, actually.
So yeah, the parties typically do that. I can tell you that in my precinct, I've never seen a poll challenger before. So it's not something that we get involved in necessarily on the state level as government officials, but the parties introduce poll challengers. And as you just heard from Secretary of State, because we are changing it this year and we don't have those precincts, we'll see how many poll challengers end up being at the polling places this election cycle.
Could I just chime in real fast? I want to put everyone at ease on this point. I get this question all the time. People are worried about armed vigilantes showing up and appointing themselves as poll watchers. We're not going to allow that. These are people that have to get the permission of the 2 parties. They already have the people that they've used in the past that they've vetted. You're not going to have just random yahoos showing up and saying, "Oh, I'm here to watch the polls." We're not going to allow that.
Yeah, and those people will be taken. I mean, the sheriffs usually are at these locations. There is security there, so I agree with the Secretary of State. Those people won't be allowed. And there still is the prohibition on electioneering within 300 feet of a polling location door. So you should not have people crowding around the polling place, either blocking entrance, causing a problem. Those people will be removed.
I know we're going to do a Q&A at the end, but I just received a question that I think is really on point with what Senator and Secretary are talking about. The question is, what exactly can a poll challenger do? I know we're approaching the issue with respect to just sort of what can't be done, but what is it that they actually can do?
Well, I'm going to start with what they can't do, which is they can't contact the voter. They can't lobby the voter. They can't challenge the voter in a literal sense of walking up and making a scene. They can't have an interaction with the voter. The voter is protected from that. They can have an interaction with the poll workers, with the County Board of Elections. The theory is that maybe these poll workers, poll watchers, they may know that someone is misrepresenting his or her identity or isn't registered or whatever. That's pretty unlikely, but it's possible. And so that's why our law allows for this. But that individual, that poll watcher, has to file that challenge with the Board of Elections, the County Board of Elections, and with the poll workers, not with the voters. So the voters will not be hassled by third parties that are at these sites, if at all, but they're not going to be intimidated or even approached by these individuals.
And even once challenged, at least this is the way it has been. Part of this is I'm glad we're having this panel because we're all talking about things, and it is different this year. The way it's been in the past, it does go to the County Board of Elections, and you can even go and have, for lack of a better term, a mini trial that day in front of the County Board of Elections. It's equal number of Democrats and Republicans. You can even have representation at this saying, no, this is who I am and I need to cast my vote today. And the parties, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, are heavily involved in this process. So it's,
Can I clarify one thing on electioneering? Is it 100 feet or 300 feet? And is it
100
from the
yards.
building? It's
Is it 3 or 100 feet? Is it?
It's 100 feet. It used to be bigger, but it was struck down.
It's 100 feet from the building where the polling is taking place. Is that correct?
That's right.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I had
it used to
100
be
yards. It used to be longer.
Yeah, it used to be bigger, but the Sixth Circuit struck it down, so it's not enforced at that full distance.
Mhm.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about early voting and absentee ballots. If I have asked for an absentee ballot, can I go show up to early voting? Secretary Adams?
Short answer is no. The plan as implemented says that if you've requested an absentee ballot, you can't vote in person unless you have not received your absentee ballot by the 28th of October. So that's another 9 days away. If you get an absentee ballot, then vote that ballot. If you don't want to mail it because you see these situations with the Postal Service, that's fine. That's why we spent $600,000 buying drop boxes and distributing those all across the state. So if you have concerns, I get it. Just put your absentee ballot in the drop box. It's just like voting in person, except there's no line. Your ballot goes right in the bin. But we're just not able to let people request a ballot and then vote a different ballot. It's just not something that we can allow for, unfortunately. Unless, of course, you didn't get your absentee ballot, in which case there's paperwork that you can fill out at the site to cancel your prior request for an absentee ballot, and then you can vote in person as though you never had applied.
I've heard a lot of talk about provisional ballots. Is that what you're referring to when you're talking about canceling your ballot, or does Kentucky not use provisional ballots?
No, this is a real technical thing. So in 2002, the Help America Vote Act that was passed by Congress and signed by the president, it made a number of changes. It created grant programs and so forth and so on. But this is a federal thing that we do only in federal elections. We didn't have them, for example, in November when I was on the ballot last year. It's a federal program. Basically, it says this: if you go to vote and someone tells you that you can't because you don't have your ID, or they can't find you on the rolls, or you already voted, whatever it is, they cannot turn you away. They have to give you a ballot. But that ballot is a provisional ballot. It only has federal elections on it. It doesn't have all the other races on it. It's just a purely federal right and federal program. And that ballot goes into a separate bin. And then you have to come back and have a hearing before the County Board of Elections and essentially prove your argument, prove why there's some sort of incorrectness as to your ability to vote, whatever that's based on. And then you get that hearing as a matter of right, and then the board either does or doesn't count your ballot. But those ballots are segregated from the other ballots of the voters that we know are legitimate. But this helps us keep from turning anybody away. Only a smattering of these are used. I think last year was like 600 something out of all the voters statewide that were voting, over 1 million voters. And so it's really a rounding error in the span of all the ballots. But these are going to be really useful to someone who has an ID, doesn't have it on them, votes, and then can come back with the ID.
Okay. And you mentioned those drop boxes for absentee ballots. If I have received an absentee ballot and I want to return it in person, how do I find out where those drop boxes are located?
The county clerk has a website with all that stuff on it. I believe that the drop boxes are at the places that you vote. And so right now, that's the 4 locations. I hope everyone has probably seen by now in the Courier, but the Yum Center, the Louisville Marriott East, the African American Heritage Center, and the Expo Center. That's right now where the drop boxes are. I believe they also have one at the election headquarters at West Ormsby, 7th and West Ormsby.
Great. And I know that those have to be postmarked by 6 p.m. on November the 3rd, and they have to be received by 6 p.m. on November the 6th. Is that correct?
Well, there's no way for us to know the time of day that it gets postmarked usually, but it needs to be postmarked November 3rd or earlier. And then 2 other things have to happen. Either if we get it the day after the election, we can count it because we know it was timely mailed. You never get mail the same day it's sent. So if we get it on the 4th, we can count it. we get on the 5th or the 6th, then we can only count it if it's got a postmark of November 3rd or earlier. If it comes in Saturday the 7th, it's discarded. So I'm encouraging voters to not even mail it back in the first place, use the drop box. But if you are going to mail it as early as you possibly can. There have been delays in postal delivery. So go ahead and get it back if you know who you're voting for. Most voters are decided one way or the other. So just go ahead and vote.
And those
The next
drop box
question is going to be for Heather. I'm sorry, I'm messing up your name. Gatnarek. I just want to switch gears a little bit. What should a person do if they feel like they're being denied access to the polls, or they see something suspicious going on at a polling location?
Yeah, so there's a few places that people can call to report this, and the Secretary of State may have some information to share as well. But I'm really excited to tell folks about some of our election protection work. So we're partnering with the Lawyers Committee out of DC, which has been doing election protection EP work for a long, long time. And they've got a really great infrastructure in place to help sort through and respond to issues that people might be facing with voting in any regard, whether that's locating their polling place, whether that's a problem with people outside the polling place, as we've been talking about. And so they run a hotline that we are now involved with, which folks may have seen or heard about, but it's a phone number that people can call. So it's 866-OUR-VOTE. And I believe actually this year there's also going to be an online feature for that. But definitely, if people see problems, think that something's not right, can't find their local polling place, we encourage everyone to contact 866-OUR-VOTE, because we will have trained volunteers in Kentucky to help respond to those and make sure that people have the information that they need. So that's something that we're really excited about this year. 866-OUR-VOTE as a hotline has existed for a long time, so people in Kentucky have always been able to call it. But we're now helping to sort of man that and respond to some of those requests, and we'll make sure that people's issues are dealt with that way. Sometimes they'll have an easy answer and sometimes they won't, but either way, no matter what, we will be responding to people's complaints and intakes there.
And Mr. Njuguna, what community services, if any, are being provided to assist people with access to voting and polling locations? You're on mute.
There we go. I think before I get to that is to highlight some of the additional work the ACLU has done in this area to get people out to vote and let them know about the importance of elections. As most people know, in 2019, the governor signed an executive order that gave the right back to many people who had felonies. And so the ACLU hired 2 people whose full-time job it is to partly go out, find these people, get them registered prior to that registration date, which just passed, talk about the importance of voting to the people in the state, and really get them, to let them know how important it is to vote in this election. But obviously, once you get people registered to vote, they got to be able to get to the polls. While we're not offering rides to the polls, there are tons of community organizations in Jefferson County that offer those. One of them is the Louisville Urban League. They are offering free rides, I believe, every Saturday from their headquarters to polling places. Just before I got on here, I noticed that the newly formed Breonna Taylor Foundation is having a ride to the polls on the 21st. People can meet at the Boys and Girls Club at Newburgh and get a ride to the polls there from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Obviously, on the day of election, TARC, as they have done, offers rides to the polls. And also the Kentuckians for the Commonwealth usually helps people get rides or coordinates those things. And I know that both major political parties also sometimes help with that. So those are ways in which people can get to the polls if they have an issue with that.
Senator McGarvey and Professor Mazo, I know that there are 2 constitutional amendments that are on the ballot as well this year. Can you all speak to what those amendments are and then what your vote on those amendments means?
I can try first. The First Amendment is Kentucky Constitutional Amendment 1 is a Marsy's Law Amendment. It's basically a victims' rights amendment. I actually have the text in front of me. So it allows victims of certain crime victims to be treated with fairness. It gives them the right to be heard in proceedings where the defendant may be release proceedings or plea proceedings or sentencing proceedings. Actually, you may remember that voters in the Commonwealth approved this by 62-3%, something like this in 2018. And Kentucky Supreme Court voided the last amendment because the full text wasn't printed. So this is kind of a go around on that. So this is kind of a victims' rights amendment that's before the voters. The other one, Constitutional Amendment 2, just changes the terms of certain judicial offices. So I think a Commonwealth attorney, the term is now going to be 8 years, or if the amendment passes, instead of 6 years. I think for a district judge, the proposed term is 8 years instead of 4 years. And I think there's a third part to it, which is in order to serve as a district judge, you have to have been a lawyer for 8 years as opposed to 2 years, which is the law now. So those are the 2 amendments, and perhaps our elected officials can say some more things about them.
Sure, and I'll take a stab at that. I'll go with Marsy's Law first, since it's the first on the ballot. It is a victims' rights bill, and of course, we have a victims' rights law on the books in Kentucky already because we want victims to have rights. As has been pointed out in testimony about this bill, even you don't choose to be a crime victim. It's often a shocking, sudden, jarring event, and to have some role and some recognized part of the process is important for a lot of victims of crime. I think this amendment, though, as written, probably goes a little too far and is in some ways unworkable. For instance, one of the things the amendment does is provide victims with the right to counsel, but there's no method of actually paying for that in the amendment that'll be part of our Constitution now. So what does that mean, right? Do we have to provide an attorney for every crime victim who requests one who can't otherwise afford one? And what will that look like for our sort of already, this is probably a bunch of lawyers on this Zoom. We've all been in the courthouse and know the burden that is on our Department of Public Advocacy and is on our prosecutors already. But that also leads to the other question: who represents them, right? By saying that they are a victim, are we infringing on the rights of the accused? Because one of the hallmarks of our justice system is that you are innocent until proven guilty. But if the state is providing counsel to someone who is a victim in your case, is that going to have, yes, they can be a victim and you could still be not guilty, right? Because you might not have committed the crime, but does it have any undue prejudice on it? And so these are some things we're going to have to really work through if this law does pass, as it did in the margins the professor mentioned in the last go round. So I think this law is a little bit more problematic once you get really into the weeds and the policy of it, but a noble goal of making sure we recognize the role and the important role that crime victims have in the process. So the second constitutional amendment, this is one, a lot of people ask me, I'm sure for the other attorneys on the call, you guys probably always get asked about who are you voting for judge and how are you voting on the constitutional amendments. And this is one where I tell people, I think the goal of this was to put the district court judges and the Commonwealth attorneys and the circuit court and family judges all on equal footing, where they all serve 8-year terms and maybe to some extent to depoliticize the court. I don't like that because I don't like to think of the courts as being political in the first place. But it does give longer terms to your district court judges. Here's the pro and the con of it. The pro is maybe it makes the courts a little less political by not having judges run every 4 years. Does make them the same as circuit court judges and now Commonwealth attorneys. Here's the con of it. If you get somebody in who's not doing the best job, got to wait 8 years to vote on them. So, there's your pro and your con, but ultimately I think it's probably a good thing to have everybody on the same footing.
Other than asking your attorney friends on how they're voting on things, do you all have recommendations on places where voters can go to become more educated on Marcy's Law or on the other constitutional amendment?
Yeah, Marcy's Law, there's a ton of stuff out there from Marcy's Law itself. It is a well-organized machine. We are not the first state to pass a version of Marcy's Law. It started, I believe, in California. You've seen states from even Florida to North Dakota have a version of Marcy's Law. So just if you Google Marcy's Law, you'll be able to find out certainly their take on it. I think that the ACLU has done a good job presenting the other sides of the argument on Marcy's Law. And I think a lot of the local defense attorneys, there have been some op-eds written about it as well. And this is one of those where politics makes strange bedfellows. You see some people far more on the left side of the political spectrum opposing Marcy's Law, and then you see some people really far on the right side of the political spectrum opposing Marcy's Law as well, and often for similar reasons. So, I think those are two places you could go for info on it. I haven't seen a lot written about extending the terms of district court judges. Like I said, on balance, I think it's a good thing. It puts everybody on equal footing, and it does require district court judges to have more legal and life experience before getting on the bench. I think that's a good change as well.
Just a word on Marcy's Law. I think there are 14 other states that have adopted a version of this, ranging from Florida, California. They're all over the place. Illinois, they're all over the place. Most of it is kind of bankrolled by a CEO whose I believe sister was the victim of a murder, and I'm going to forget the company. It's Broadband or Broadcom or something like this. And so a lot of the money behind these movements kind of comes from one source. It's not good or bad. It is empirically true. And in a lot of states where it was adopted by referendum as opposed to legislatures adopting it. So this is placed, before voters, and there's a kind of a yes or no choice, and so that's a way to get there. And as opposed to, there are problems because there's no deliberation, in a legislature. So, again, there's good and bad to it, but there's lots of information on the internet about this.
Professor Gene.
Sorry, just to that, you can read this amendment, both of these amendments for yourself at sos.ky.gov. You can find your sample ballot, and then that way, before you go vote, if you're voting in person, you have a chance to actually sit at home and look at what the ballot's going to look like, and it'll help you learn who's there and maybe read up on who the candidates are for judge and so forth. But the amendments are on there as well. You can read them.
In fact, the problem in 2018 was that you couldn't read the amendment on the ballot, so now that's been solved.
Yeah, and that is important to point out, Secretary Adams. I'm glad that you brought that up because it's also, I think you can get to it from the govoteky.gov as well, get you to your sample ballot that way. I found that website incredibly easy to use and find a lot of information. And those amendments, to the voters that are listening, those amendments are quite lengthy and take some time to digest, even if you're a trained lawyer. And used to reading things like that. So I encourage everybody to take an opportunity to read those ahead of time. Professor, are you aware of whether or not Marcy's Law has any pending challenges in those other states that have adopted it?
I don't know. I mean, this is, I mostly deal with voting rights and election law and campaign finance, and this is really kind of in the criminal realm a little bit more. I think that defense attorneys are opposed to this, and so people who deal with criminal law just have a greater stake. And again, as we heard, this law has created kind of strange bedfellows, and has in other states too, where kind of liberal groups like the ACLU take strange positions. I don't strange. It creates strange bedfellows. I mean, in the campaign finance world, which I've written about, you again get these very strange kind of alliances where the ACLU is kind of aligned with more kind of free speech advocates. And this law has done some similar things, but there's a lot of information on the internet if you just Google Marcy's Law. And in fact, if you Google Marcy's Law in Kentucky, you're going to get a lot of information with lots of people advocating for or against it.
There are, I'll just point out, Heather with the ACLU here, there are a couple of broader challenges to Marsy's law in other states. I know Pennsylvania has one pending right now that challenges the law sort of as a whole, but because the amendment is so incredibly broad and because it covers so many aspects of the criminal legal system, what we do see are challenges that come up case by case that may tackle parts of Marsy's law. So one place where we've seen a lot of litigation about this is in Florida, and so they have not irregular appellate court decisions in Florida trying to interpret pieces of Marsy's law as they've come up in individual criminal cases. And the same thing had happened in California, which was the first state to pass this. So definitely one of the reasons that we've been opposed to Marsy's law from the very beginning is because, first of all, we already have a statutory Victims' Bill of Rights that lays forth all of these rights that are in the Marsy's Law Amendment. But secondly, because to put this language and some of the sort of vague or inconsistent language into our Constitution makes it so very likely that we will have to see these challenges fought out case by case by case in our courts. And we know our courts are already struggling to make sure that, you know, people get heard and that cases are heard in a timely manner. And we just feel that this would be a real sort of throw some chaos into that system. So we've opposed it from the very beginning. I know Senator McGarvey in the legislature has heard me testify against this several times, but there is a lot of information on our website about it. Unfortunately, you know, the proponents of Marsy's law have millions of dollars to spend on campaigning and on websites that we just simply don't have. So if you Google Marsy's law for Kentucky, you will get the proponents' websites. You'll have to sort of come to the aclu-ky.org website to find our information because it's otherwise not boosted on Google in that same way. But we definitely have it all up there. And if there's more questions about it, like, feel free to reach out to any of us and we're happy to talk about it.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in there really quickly, and Heather, correct me if I'm wrong on this. What you heard Heather just say, I think, is an interesting point about this particular bill. And Professor, you even sort of alluded to this. If you like the law and you like policy, this is one of those where there's almost universal agreement that we need to recognize victims' roles in the process. And as Heather said, we have a statute that already has, we want victims to have rights in Kentucky. This is really an interesting debate about whether Marsy's law is the best way for those victims to get rights.
So it's my opinion that Marsy's law has gotten a lot of attention, as well as everyone is fully aware that this is the year of the presidential election. But that's not the only thing on the ballot. We do have, as Professor Mazo said earlier, a question about should we extend the experience requirement for those running for district court judge? Should we extend the term of the Commonwealth attorney? And I tossed this question to our ACLU representatives. What can we do to encourage voters to be educated on that topic and not just cast your vote for the president, or not just cast your vote for the constitutional amendments, but also the things that, at least from a lawyer perspective, really affect us, which is how long a judge should sit on the bench before they have to run for re-election. If you could speak to that.
Sure, I'll jump in first, and Heather has. People should. We always hear, politics are local. All politics are local. And sometimes the local races are going to be something that affects you more directly and clearly than a federal race. And it's really important that people go out and read about the laws that we just talked about here to ask themselves whether or not they really want to extend the terms of the Commonwealth and County Attorney and the judges to 8 years. In my opinion, those are really long times for those positions to be for voters, them not to be held accountable to the voters. People might disagree with that, but they should educate themselves on that, on whether or not they agree or not agree with that. People should also look to see if they're local council races. Those people and those positions are going to have more effect on your life because they're voting on the local budget, how big the police department is. They're going to be voting on the FOP contract. They're going to vote on, deciding on, does your street get paved, not get paved, your garbage get picked up. those things are that directly affect people. And those races, like I keep saying, are sometimes more important than, not necessarily more important, but more of a direct. So people should really educate themselves on the complete ballot. And one way they can do that is to go to the websites, and you can look at your ballot before you go to the polls and look at it, and that way you can educate yourself. I'm sure Heather's got more to say.
You covered everything. Thank you.
I'll step in there too really quickly then, because absolutely, I mean, it's got to be more than the presidential race. And look, the presidential race is important. I am not diminishing the importance of the presidential race, particularly this year. But even with the presidential race being this important, I contend that your local legislators have a greater impact on your day-to-day life as a Kentuckian than your federal representatives. And look at what we're talking about. Even with both the constitutional amendments, whether you should have Marcy's Law, whether you should have judges having 8-year terms, guess why you're voting on those? Because the legislature put them on the ballot. The legislature, just on this call, so the legislature put those initiatives on the ballot. The legislature is the body that requires you to have a photo ID at the polls when you go vote this year. Those are laws that we pass, and you can criticize the Kentucky General Assembly all you want to. I might have shared in some of your criticism of it, but you cannot call us a do-nothing legislature. We pass laws every year that have an impact on the lives of Kentuckians, and to know who your legislators are, to know who your judges are, to know who your council people are. These are the branches of government. These are the people in government that you are most likely to encounter on a daily basis. And if you just vote on president, then you're really missing a major opportunity to have a say in how your city and state are run.
I want to say a word on this. Actually, Senator McGarvey points to a real irony in the law of voting. The states control 90% of your life, and federal law controls maybe 10% of everybody's life, not only in Kentucky, but in every state. And yet, we know from election to election that the top of the ticket really drives voting. In other words, almost every single person in the country has an opinion about the presidential race. And as you march down the ballot and you go down, 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 people are, they're less educated about what happens below. But those things below, or on the flip side, or the amendments, really impact your life. And what we see is, what we election law people call bullet voting. In other words, people will hit the top of the ballot, and then some people won't vote as they keep going down. And this is a huge mistake that voters make, because they're just not educating themselves well enough about what else is on the ballot, what other races are there. And they're, those races are much more impactful on people's lives than the top of the ticket, in many ways, right? Your state officials don't control foreign policy, but foreign policy doesn't impact your life that much. In other ways, what your state officials do really impacts your lives. So it behooves everybody to really, really educate themselves about what's on the ballot.
Thank you guys for that discussion. That was really insightful. Secretary Adams, we've heard a lot of discussion about election week and election season versus election day. Now, in the past, we've had one day, and at the end of the day, we all sit down and turn on our TV and watch all the results come in. And as you've already discussed, that's going to be a little different this year, since we have so many different opportunities to vote, ways to vote. And as you mentioned, we'll have that 30% of voting in each of those categories. So what are you anticipating November 3rd will look like in the state of Kentucky? And when do you anticipate, based on the information you have now, when we'll know Kentucky's election results?
Well, I have some good news and some bad news. I'll give you the bad news first. I don't think we're going to know who the president is for a couple of weeks. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, these big swing states, they're going to do things differently than Kentucky. Number one, they're going to rely more disproportionately on absentee voting than in-person voting. And number two, they're not going to even begin processing their absentee ballots they receive until the polls close on election day. Kentucky's going to be different. Kentucky, like every other state that's voted this year in the pandemic, we took about a week to count our ballots. That's par for the course. Took a week to count our ballots in the primary. But the governor and I made some changes for November so we can have a faster count. Number one, As I said earlier, only about 30% of voters are going to vote absentee in the general election. This is by their own choice. They haven't been kept from that. But most voters want to vote in person. Well, the upside of that is that means we can have a faster count. It's a quicker count to push a button on an election machine and get your total than it is to run ballot after ballot after ballot through a machine for absentee. So bare minimum, we're going to have 70% of the vote in election night because those are votes cast on machines. And then we're going to have the majority of the absentee votes counted election night too. The governor and I provided for those to be processed on a rolling basis on receipt. As of close of business Saturday, more than half of the absentee ballots that have been requested have been voted and returned and received back by the county clerks. So we're going to have at least, if not a single another vote were delivered to a drop box or mailed back, we would still have 85% of the votes in election night counted. So we're going to be what we usually are in America, which is one of the first states to report on election night who we voted for. To be clear, not every vote is going to be in at that point because we are allowing for voters to have 3 days afterward for their ballots to arrive if they've been timely mailed. But we don't think that'll be most votes. We think most votes will be received and processed by then, and we'll have finality for the voters and the candidates. But it won't be, if it's a really close race, you have to give us some time. Normally, a really close race isn't decided election night. Remember the governor's race, it took about 9 days to call that race. And that's not unusual in Kentucky if we have a close race. It might go to a recanvass or a recount or something, and then we'll know it later. But I think on election night, we'll know the outcome of the vast majority of our races.
Can I add to this a little bit? I want to paint a more positive picture than Secretary Adams did. There could be a lot of things that could go wrong in this election. And I can tell you people in my field and secretaries of state all over the country are losing a lot of sleep over this. But let me paint a positive picture. In US presidential elections, about 56% of registered voters vote. It ranges, but it hovers at 55 or 56 or 57%. We have 5 states that use all vote by mail elections. They are Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and now Hawaii and Utah. And in this election, there are 5 states that are automatically sending vote by mail or absentee ballots, whatever you want to call them, to all of their voters automatically. They're California, Nevada, New Jersey, the District of Columbia, and Vermont. What we see in states where people get absentee ballots or mail ballots is that the percentage of voting goes up. And I think we saw that in Kentucky. People have the ballot and it's sitting on their desk and or on their dinner table, and they talk to their children or to their spouses or to their parents or grandparents and are much better educated voters. And so every state can't process these ballots, but there's a lot of things that could go wrong. But I think what you're going to see is voting is going to go up all across the country in this election. In virtually every state, you're going to have a higher percentage of people voting than you did in 2016 in the last presidential election. I think that's a good thing for the United States. Now, how much it goes up is going to depend on each state. It's going to be different from state to state to state. And you know how states process those ballots and when they count those ballots and when they begin to count those ballots, that is going to be different from state to state to state. But overall, you're going to have an election, I think. I mean, we don't know, but we're going to have an election where we're going to see a higher percentage of Americans coming out to vote in this election because we're holding something that's totally unprecedented. Every single state is doing something new that it wasn't doing 2 years ago or 4 years ago. And I don't know if this is better for democracy. It should be. We'll see. There are a lot of problems that could happen. But overall, we're going to have more people voting. And compared to European countries, we vote in lower percentages. We can debate about why that is, but it's just true. So there's a kind of silver lining in the pandemic, which is that we're going to have more people voting. And whoever is elected is going to be elected with more people participating in the process. And ultimately, that's good. That's good for our democracies. It makes us a better country, a better Commonwealth, and so forth. So I want to say that there's a silver lining in these problems that secretaries of state are facing all around the country. They're losing a lot of sleep, but it's better for all of us as a people. I'll just end there.
Can I chime in on that too? Part about losing sleep, that's accurate. I'm happy to see the higher turnout. I'm really proud that we made changes, and I think some of them should be made permanent. But in any event, we made changes to make voting easier this year. Let me give you one more silver lining. One of my policy goals for my term was to move Kentucky toward paper balloting, away from machines and more toward paper balloting. I traveled the state for 21 months campaigning for this office, and I found lots of issues people disagreed on different parts of the state. But the one thing that everyone liked, that I talked to across the spectrum, was they liked paper ballots. With paper ballots, you've got a paper trail. You can still have a relatively quick count on the machines running you through, but you also get the security of your paper trail. Whether your concern is foreign interference and potential hacking, whether your concern is vote fraud, whatever it is that you're worried about, paper ballots help address that. And even if you aren't concerned about those things, if you just want to have the ability to have an accurate recount. We had a state rep race in Owensboro 2 years ago where we really couldn't figure out who won because a lot of the votes were on machines instead of on paper. We couldn't really do a real recount. So I like paper ballots. When I took office, we had 29 counties that didn't have paper ballot capacity. We've drawn on federal grants, the CARES Act, but also other federal grants to help counties upgrade their equipment to paper ballots. And now all 120 counties use paper ballots. So that's again, it's in the context, it's a silver lining really of other news that's not as good, but we've made the best of that situation, and there's going to be permanent improvement now in our election system.
I'll ask this question to Senator McGarvey as well as Secretary Adams and really anyone else who wants to answer. I am curious about what specific safeguards are in place to protect the election results.
Well, go ahead, Senator.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Secretary. You outrank me on this one.
Well, I'm not sure which results you mean, but I can talk about the protections we have on absentee balloting, for example. Look, I don't have any animosity to absentee balloting. I voted absentee my first election in 1994 when I moved from Paducah to Louisville to go to U of L. I don't have the stigma against it that a lot of Republicans have. In any event, it's more secure now than it was in 1994 when I first started voting absentee. With the use of the portal at govotky.com that we implemented, it has so many benefits. One is it's much more easy for the voter to request a ballot. It's also much easier for the clerk to process the request. A lot of that burden is shifted to Frankfurt. It's also easier for me to surveil the election. I can tell in real time if there's an address that's requested multiple ballots. I have the ability to monitor if ballots are lost or stolen. And so it's an improvement. We have barcodes now on the absentee ballots, so we can track them the way we track UPS packages, and so can the voter. 24/7, you can go to govotky.com and track your ballot. So that's something that's new. Something that's been around for a long time is signature verification. That's something that has predated me by a long, long time. But basically, the notion that you got to sign in two places, and we judge your signature there against your signature of record. That's long established law. What we didn't have, though, was a cure process. If a voter signed a different way than they normally sign, then it used to be that just got thrown in the garbage. In 2018, we had 8% of absentee ballots discarded due to signature or other similar issues. In May, it was only 3%. That was 3%, though, a much bigger number because so many more voters were voting absentee. So in terms of things I want to make permanent, we can talk about that if you want. The two things I think are really critical are, number one, the portal. You got to keep that. You can't chuck that and this election is over. It's good to ensure ballot integrity, let alone convenience of the voter and the clerk. But also need to keep the cure process so we don't disenfranchise people because they sign their name differently today than they signed their voter registration card 20 or 30 years ago. I think those are really good, humane improvements that just make the system better. And they also lend to public confidence in the system. A lot of people on the right attacked me after the primary saying, oh, we had 30,000 ballots thrown out because you were a by-mail election. Well, okay, but it's because we followed the ballot integrity laws. So why don't we have a process where we enforce that law, but we also give the voter a chance to cure the mistake? So I think these are pretty low-hanging fruit type things that hopefully the legislature will consider when they come back.
Yeah, and look, I hope we do too. I think we absolutely are seeing the success of, guess what? When you make it easier for people to do something, they do it. And we're making it easier for people to vote, and we're having people vote in record numbers. I don't think that's a coincidence. So I want to see that continue. To the question about, how do we maintain election results? I want to point out, this is something the Secretary of State and I have talked about in public, in committee hearings, and in private in the hallways. We don't have a problem of in-person election fraud in Kentucky. And there really hasn't been that traditional problem. And so I agree with the Secretary's assessment that by having this be more of a centralized process, it's making it easier to monitor. And if there were major types of election fraud, and I don't know of any, the Secretary can correct me if I'm wrong, then again, they're easier to detect. And so what I see is a better process. Is it one we can improve? Of course. We can improve what we're doing right now. But I think we should also take a second to say, you know what, in the middle of a global pandemic, we shifted very quickly with a Republican Secretary of State and a Democratic governor and came up with a system that is more fair and is working for more people. We're going to take this experience and we're going to make the voting process in Kentucky better, safer, more fair, and more accessible going forward.
In fact, I would say there's with in-person voting fraud, I mean, we have so many trees have been cut down for this, to publish this research. There's basically no in-person voting fraud in the United States. The cases that exist are very, very small in number compared to the billions and billions of votes cast. With voting by mail, there is an issue, which is that somebody could touch that ballot after the voter fills it out. And we saw in a congressional election in North Carolina, with, specialists sometimes call this ballot harvesting. This is an issue, and I think states have really ramped up their learning and their diligence on this issue. I know every Secretary of State I've ever spoken to takes this issue extremely seriously, and most of the states do. Again, the cases are very small in number, but I can tell you in 2016, 23.7% of Americans voted in some way by mail. In this election, it's going to be more than 50% if you look at all the states. So there are new issues that all of us have to deal with and figure out how to solve. We should thank our elected officials that they're thinking about these issues. I think about them and write about them, and sometimes my phone rings and people call me and ask me about them. But at the end of the day, you guys are losing sleep, right? We're very close to an election with lots of new things going on. And voters should be vigilant. If you find that there's something that's not right, or you know of something that's not right, you should call your elected officials and report that.
Can I just fast different angle on the this are kind of high country or this is almost like a Greenacres episode trying to explain this, but this is how old-fashioned it actually is. The county clerks elections on, they literally back elections. Fax machine. My office has those has machine. We don't use technology to speak of to calculate our election returns. We certainly don't use a foreign national or a company or a company that's based outside of the country or what have you. It's forms that are written on the back
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time, but we did receive some questions from our audience. So I'm going to pass it to Sarah, and she's going to ask our first question.
On the topic that we were just speaking on, we received a question about the ballots that were found in a dumpster in Jefferson County. I don't know if anybody on our panel can speak to the current state of that investigation. Maybe Secretary Adams, I don't know how, I'm assuming you've been very involved in that investigation, but if there's anything that you can speak to others on that issue.
Yeah. Here's I can't tell you everything, but here's what I can say publicly. There are 112 unopened absentee ballots that are going absentee ballots. They've been sent out by the county clerk, they have not yet been received by the voter. They had not been cast. They were ballots in that were discarded by a postal worker. We don't have reason to believe that postal workers was trying to tamper with the election. We believe that postal workers was simply trying to not have to do that person's job, was lazy and dumped the mail. It happens regularly with the post office. I mean, it's not an everyday situation, obviously, but it happens. And usually when it happens, there's an election 2 weeks away. So we don't believe that this individual was targeting any voter or targeting a campaign or the election. It's just a swap for a person that wanted to get off their head that day and just dump the mail and just yeah.
Secretary Adams, we are having a difficult time understanding you. I wonder if you could log out and then log back in. And while you're doing that, maybe Professor Mazo, you can maybe talk to the voters about the Electoral College and how many electoral votes Kentucky has, and whether, or Senator McGarvey.
No, I want the professor to talk. I just want to say thank you guys for having me. I do have to go to my next thing now, though. So just wanted to thank you guys for the opportunity. And Professor, I wish I could listen to the Electoral College analysis because we are all interested in it right now. So thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Senator.
Yep.
So, Professor, the question is, how many votes does Kentucky
How many
have?
congressmen do we have in Kentucky?
And then how are they split? Do they all go to the winner, or do they go proportionally based on the popular vote?
Okay, so under the Constitution, each state gets the number of electors as it has congressmen plus senators. And then under the 23rd Amendment, the District of Columbia gets the same number of electors as the state with the smallest population. So the state with the smallest population. So there's 435 congressmen. There are 100 senators, so that's 535. And then the District of Columbia gets the same number of electors, 3, as the state with the smallest population has, which is Wyoming. So that's how we get 100 plus 435 plus 3, which is 538. If you divide that by 2, the number is 269, and therefore you need 270 to win. That's how we get to that number. So we take the number of senators we have, the number of congressmen we have, we add 3 for the District of Columbia, that's 538. We divide it by 2, that's 269. That's why you need 270 to win. 48 of the states appoint their electors by whoever wins the popular vote, and Kentucky is one of those states. So the parties submit names of electors, and you know, if the Democrats win, then their electors get appointed. If the Republicans win, their electors get appointed. These are usually senior party officials. I've actually, you know, not everybody does this, but I've met many people who have been in the Electoral College and interviewed them and spoken to them because I'm sort of interested in this. Where I grew up, I learned that a neighbor of mine when I was a child was a presidential elector in a year. That kind of excited me. 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, actually split their electors by congressional district. So whoever wins the majority of the vote in that congressional district gets the elector from that district. And then whoever wins the majority of the state vote gets the 2 extra. And so what we often see in Maine elections or Nebraska elections is that they will split, you know, for example, Nebraska has 5 electoral votes. So 4 will go to one candidate, 1 will go to the other. Or Maine in 2016 voted 3 votes for Hillary and 1 vote for Trump. So that's basically how it works. Yeah. So Kentucky should have 8 votes, I think, right?
That's right.
2 for the senators, 6 for each of the congressmen.
That's right.
Kentucky has 8 votes. Now, there's a controversy about whether the Electoral College is the best way to elect the president, because on a per capita basis, Wyoming has less than 700,000 people and has 3 electoral votes. California has 39, almost 40 million people, and has 55 electoral votes. So each member of the Electoral College represents 700,000 Californians, but only 230,000 people in Wyoming. So there's a controversy about that. But we've been using the same system since not 1789, because the 12th Amendment, which was passed in 1804, changed the way we vote. Right? So in the beginning of the Republic, electors cast 1 vote for president and 1 for vice president. And so sometimes your vice president was the person who was running against you for president. And we changed that in 1804. Now they cast 2 votes, 1 for president, 1 for vice president. In other words, the person who got the second most votes before became the vice president. And we changed that in 1804. So that's the way the system works, and that's the way it's always worked. And people often, this is what happens after the election. People call me and they say, but so-and-so won the popular vote, and a different candidate won the electoral vote. I get this question every single election cycle. And my answer, to be very fair, is we don't have a popular vote contest. If we had a popular vote contest, the campaigns would have done something entirely differently for the last 18 months before Election Day. They would have spent 0 time in Wisconsin, 0 time in New Hampshire, or some of these closer flip states. They would have gone to states that have very high populations, and they would have run ads there instead of running them where they ran them. So we don't have a way as social scientists to figure out who would have won that popular vote contest, because it didn't happen. So what I think the media does is cobble together the popular votes in each state and considers that the national popular vote. And in 5 elections in American history, that vote hasn't matched the Electoral College vote. But we don't actually have a popular vote contest. So, we can debate this all day and all weekend. But if we did have a contest, we don't actually know who would have won that contest, because there's no way to know, because the campaigns would have done something different. They would have gone and sought different votes from different people. And so the only contest we have is the Electoral College contest.
Well, that takes us to the end of our program. We've got just a couple of requests to close us out. Secretary Adams, we've been submitted a question. If you could go over again the forms of ID that a person needs to have at the polls. And Heather, if you could speak to the telephone number that you gave earlier in the program, there's a request for that as well.
So you can vote with any federal, state, or local government issued photo ID that has your photo and your name on it. It can be federal military, it can be state driver's license, it can be any federal, state, or local government issued ID. You can also use a photo ID issued by a public or private college that's in the United States. You don't have to go to school in Kentucky. You can go to at a state school and still use that at the polling site. If you do not have a photo ID on you, but you've got it back at home or what have you, you can vote a provisional ballot and then come back. But you won't be able to get the local races on there, or just be the federal races. You can vote without any ID at all if you know a poll worker. That's not as typical in, say, Jefferson County, but out in the rural areas, it's fairly typical for people to know their poll worker. You don't have to have an ID in that instance. You can vote on the recognition of your poll worker. If you do not have a photo ID and you cannot get a photo ID, whether it's due to COVID, whether it's due to your work schedule, your family responsibilities, we've got, I think it's 9 different categories, 8 in the statute, and then one I used my emergency powers to create for this election. A reason you can't get a photo ID, then you can vote without a photo ID. But 2 things are the case. 1, you need an approved non-photo ID. That can be a government benefit card, it can be a credit card or a debit card. And you have to sign an oath of voter. This is essentially a document where you swear that this is your identity. So those are the options you have when you go vote. And we think, of course, most voters already have a photo ID and they'll utilize that. We also understand that in this unique time, not everyone can get an ID. I'm really proud that we budgeted $300,000 to help poor people get free IDs. They used to cost $23 to get a state ID. Now they're free. But given the fact that a lot of our issuing officials have been closed due to COVID, or they've got backlogs now that because they've been closed due to COVID, it's just not realistic in many cases to ask people to go get one or to stand in a line. If we're letting people vote at home because they're concerned about going out, you can't expect them to go get an ID and stand in a line. So those are some of the changes that we've made in light of the current pandemic.
And then, Michelle, I'll give that number again. So the number that folks in Kentucky, really this is a number, it's across the country. So if you have friends and family outside Kentucky, tell them about this too. But the number to call if you have problems or questions about voting is 866-HOUR-VOTE, which I'll drop into the chat here. And this is also a website. If you look at the website, it's 866-HOUR-VOTE. It has a lot of information on the site, but then you can also be reporting any problems or questions that you have. And then I'm going to drop one more thing into the chat, which is that we are, along with this effort, we at the ACLU of Kentucky and a couple other of the nonpartisan groups in Kentucky are working to organize volunteers. So it is too late to sign up to be a poll worker, but there are still ways that folks can volunteer to help with the election. So this will be people who are trained to help respond to some of those requests that come in through 866-HOUR-VOTE and a couple of other things. I'm going to put a Gmail account into this chat. It's going to be aclukyvote@gmail.com. And if you have any interest in volunteering in any regard as far as monitoring the polls on the day of, or not as a poll worker, but just being aware of what's happening at the polls, or in helping us monitor 866-HOUR-VOTE, feel free to reach out to us here and we can get you hooked up.
Many thanks to each of our panelists. This has been very informative. I'm very happy to know that it sounds like we're in good hands with our election system, at least here in the Bluegrass States. So thank you for making the time. I know that everyone is busy and we're a little past 7:30, so probably dinner time. But thank you to everyone that joined us. And thank you to each and every one of our panelists.
Thank you.
Pleased to be here.